She scrubbed floors in the castle where her father's blood ran through noble veins, but never through her. For 16 years, Ira lived as the bastard everyone wished would disappear, the shameful secret of a count who spat at her feet when she dared whisper the word father. Every day she stared at those towering stone walls, wondering if she would die without ever mattering to anyone, without ever being seen as more than a mistake. But when a king arrives at the castle and his eyes fall upon a simple pendant hanging from her neck, a Nordic hammer identical to the one he wears, everything Ira thought she knew about her life shatters like glass. Because that pendant belonged to someone the king buried 20 years ago, someone whose blood, if it truly runs in her veins, would make her royalty. And as a letter sealed in mud and time reveals impossible truths, Ira finds herself caught between a count who will do anything to keep his secrets buried and a king who's willing to rewrite history itself. But there's one devastating truth that no one has spoken yet. One secret so dangerous it could elevate her to a princess or send her to the executioner's block. And the man who holds that secret is standing in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything. The mist clung to the village like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating. Ira's hands trembled, not from the biting cold of the washing water, but from something far deeper, something that lived beneath her ribs like a blade slowly turning. She scrubbed the linen until her knuckles bled, the pink water swirling around her fingers as she stared at the castle rising beyond the barren fields. Up there, behind those stone walls, her father's blood ran warm through noble veins. Down here, in the mud and shame, that same blood meant nothing. Less than nothing. It meant she was a mistake the world wished to forget. The village knew what she was before she could even walk. Whispers followed her like hungry dogs, the bastard child of Count Ragnar and a dead servant woman. Fridas had been her mother's name, though no one spoke it anymore. The woman had died bringing Ira into a world that didn't want her, leaving behind only a simple pendant, a Nordic hammer that hung now against Ira's chest, hidden beneath her threadbare dress. Every morning, as dawn broke cold and merciless over the valley, Ira would pause in her work and look toward those imposing walls. Her chest would tighten, her throat would close. She waited for something she couldn't name, a word, a gesture, a glance that said she belonged somewhere, that she was someone's daughter. But the castle remained silent, and the name she longed to hear, daughter, never came. The morning the count descended to the courtyard, the entire village held its breath. Ira had been scrubbing the tavern floor when she heard the commotion. The thunder of hooves, the clinking of armor, the desperate shuffle of starving villagers gathering like crows around a carcass. Count Ragnar sat tall on his black warhorse, his face carved from stone, his eyes as cold as winter lakes. He tossed bread and copper coins to the crowd with the casual disdain of a man feeding animals. Ira's heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat. Something inside her, something reckless and aching, pushed her forward through the mass of bodies. She didn't plan it. The word escaped her lips before she could swallow it back. Father. The single syllable fell like a stone into still water. The courtyard went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The clatter of coins ceased. Heads turned, eyes widened. Ira's blood roared in her ears as Count Ragnar slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze toward her. For one heartbeat, one impossible suspended moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, fear. But then his face hardened into something cruel and final. He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. I have no bastard daughters. And then he spat. The glob of saliva hit the ground between them with a wet sound that seemed to echo forever. Laughter erupted, sharp, vicious, hungry. The villagers who had watched her scrub their floors and empty their chamber pots now laughed at her shame. Ira stood frozen, her body rigid, her mind unable to process what had just happened. The smell of horse dung and humiliation burned in her nostrils. Her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The laughter surrounded her like a cage. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the dirt, her lungs screaming for air. She didn't stop until she reached the well behind the tavern. where she collapsed against the cold stone and finally let the tears come. They burned like acid down her cheeks. Her hands shook so violently she had to press them against her stomach to make them stop. She had been foolish, stupid, desperate. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had tried to claim something that was never hers to claim. Never again, she swore. Never again would she speak that word. Never again would she look at the castle with hope in her chest. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 3 days later, a messenger arrived on horseback, his banner bearing the royal seal. The entire village gathered to hear the announcement. His Majesty the King would be visiting Count Ragnar's castle within the fortnight. Preparations were to begin immediately. The tavern buzzed with excitement and fear. Ira, scrubbing the same floor she had scrubbed 1,000 times before, felt something strange kindle inside her chest, a tiny flame of something that felt dangerously like hope. Old Bjorn, the tavern keeper who had taken pity on her years ago, noticed the change in her eyes. He leaned close, his weathered face grave. "Kings don't bring mercy, girl. They bring judgment." Ira touched the pendant beneath her dress, feeling its weight against her heart. Something was coming. She didn't know what. But every instinct in her body told her that when the king arrived, nothing would ever be the same. The castle loomed in the distance, its towers sharp against the darkening sky. Inside those walls, Count Ragnar sat in his chambers, staring at the royal messenger's announcement, with hands that trembled just slightly. He poured himself wine with shaking fingers. His eyes kept drifting to the window, to the village below, to the place where a girl with his eyes lived in the shadow of his shame. And far away, in the royal city, a king prepared for a journey that would unearth secrets buried 20 years deep, secrets that would shake the foundations of honor, blood, and truth. The castle had transformed into a living beast, breathing chaos through every corridor and chamber. Servants rushed past one another like ants in a disturbed nest, their arms laden with linens, silver platters, and baskets of bread still warm from the ovens. The stone walls that usually echoed with silence now thrummed with frantic energy, barked orders, clattering pots, the scrape of furniture being dragged across floors. Era moved through it all like a ghost, her hands working automatically while her mind spun in dangerous circles. She carried buckets of water up the narrow servants' stairs, her shoulders aching, her dress soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the familiar weight of invisibility, something else pulsed, a wild, reckless thing that made her heart beat too fast and her breath come too shallow. Old Bjorn watched her from the kitchen doorway, his rheumy eyes sharp despite his age. He had been working in this castle since before Era was born, had seen servant girls come and go, had witnessed births and deaths and secrets that rotted in the walls like mold. He knew the look in her eyes. He had seen it before in young people who stood too close to the edge of a cliff and wondered what it would feel like to jump. When Era passed him carrying an armload of firewood, he caught her wrist. His grip was gentle but firm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone who serves kings walks away with their life, girl." The words settled over her like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She looked into his weathered face and saw something there that made her stomach twist. Not just concern, but fear. Real fear. The kind that came from knowing too much about how power worked, about how easily a life could be snuffed out when it became inconvenient. Ira swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. But even as the warning echoed in her mind, that reckless thing inside her only burned brighter. The danger wasn't just that she might be noticed, it was that she might be forgotten forever, that she would scrub floors and empty chamber pots until she died without ever being seen as anything more than a mistake. The banquet hall blazed with torchlight that evening, casting dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fruit pies, wheels of cheese, and pitchers of wine that gleamed like rubies in the firelight. Nobles filled the benches, their voices rising and falling in waves of laughter and gossip, their fine clothes a sharp contrast to the rough wool and stained aprons of the servants who moved silently between them. Ira knelt beside the head table, her knees pressed against cold stone, a heavy pitcher of wine clutched in her trembling hands. The heat from the fires made her dizzy. The smell of roasted boar and honeyed mead mingled with expensive perfumes, and the underlying stench of unwashed bodies packed too close together. And then she saw him. The king sat at the center of the high table, his presence commanding even in stillness. His beard was shot through with silver, his face lined with years of war and judgment. But his eyes, those eyes were sharp as freshly honed blades, missing nothing. He wore his authority like a second skin, natural and absolute. When he laughed, the nobles around him laughed. When he fell silent, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Hera poured wine for the nobleman beside the king, her hands shaking so badly that drops splashed onto the white tablecloth. She kept her eyes down, tried to make herself smaller, invisible. But as she moved to fill the next goblet, she felt it. The weight of a gaze so heavy it made her freeze mid-motion. Slowly, terribly, she lifted her eyes. The king was staring directly at her. The world contracted to that single point of connection. The noise of the hall faded to a distant hum. Her heart stopped, then stuttered back to life with a painful lurch. The king's eyes moved from her face downward, and she realized with dawning horror what he was looking at. The pendant. Her mother's pendant had slipped free from her dress and now hung in plain view against her chest, catching the torchlight, a simple Nordic hammer etched with symbols she had never been able to read. "Girl." His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise like a sword through silk. Conversation died in ripples, spreading outward from the high table. Nobles turned to stare. Servants pressed themselves against the walls. Hera's vision tunneled. Her lungs refused to work. The pitcher in her hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. "Where did you get that necklace?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Hera's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked desperately toward old Bjorn, who stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, his face drained of color. She looked toward Count Ragnar, who sat 3 seats down from the king, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. The count's face had gone pale as death. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. His eyes, those cold, dismissive eyes that had refused to see her for 16 years, now burned with something that looked terrifyingly like panic. The king leaned forward, and Hera saw it then, the pendant that hung around his own neck, larger and more ornate than hers, but unmistakably the same design, the same hammer, the same symbols, the same mark. "I asked you a question, child." The king's voice was softer now, but somehow that made it worse. There was something dangerous in that gentleness, something that suggested he already knew the answer and was merely testing her. Her voice came out as a croak. She swallowed hard and tried again. "It was my mother's, your majesty." "And your mother's name?" "Fridas, sire. She died when I was born." The name hit the hall like a thunderclap. Someone gasped. A goblet fell and shattered, wine spreading across the floor like blood. The king's face underwent a transformation, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by something harder, more complex. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against stone, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. "Everyone out." The command was absolute. Nobles stumbled over themselves to obey, their curiosity warring with their fear. Servants fled like startled birds. Within moments, the great hall stood empty, save for 3 figures. The king, towering and terrible in the torchlight. Count Ragnar, still seated but looking as if he might vomit at any moment. And Ira, kneeling on the cold stone floor with her mother's pendant burning against her chest like a brand. The king's eyes never left her face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of buried years and unanswered questions. "Tell me everything, girl. And know that lies spoken before a king carry a very heavy price." The silence in the great hall pressed against Hera's eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. She could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the crackle of the torches, could hear Count Ragnar's ragged breathing from where he sat frozen at the high table. Her knees ached against the stone floor, but she didn't dare move. The king stood before her like a mountain, immovable, ancient, capable of crushing her with a single word. "Speak, child." His voice was softer now, but that softness felt more dangerous than shouting. It was the gentleness of a hunter coaxing a wounded animal from its hiding place. Era's throat constricted. Her fingers found the pendant, clutching it so tightly the metal edges bit into her palm. "I don't know much, Your Majesty. I was just a baby when my mother died. They told me she was a servant here, in this castle. She gave me this necklace before she—" The words caught in her throat like fish bones. "Before she passed." The king moved closer, each footstep deliberate and heavy. He stopped directly in front of her, and Era forced herself to keep her eyes lowered, staring at his boots, fine leather, polished to a shine that reflected the torchlight. She could smell him now, leather and wood smoke and something else, something that reminded her of cold mountain air. "Look at me." It wasn't a request. Era raised her eyes slowly, past the embroidered tunic, past the thick silver chain around his neck, until she met his gaze. Up close, his face was a map of years lived hard. Scars cutting through his beard, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. But those eyes themselves were sharp and clear, the pale gray of winter ice, and they studied her with an intensity that made her feel transparent. Fridas. The name fell from his lips like a prayer or a curse, she couldn't tell which. "I knew a woman by that name once, many years ago, before the Northern Wars, before—" He trailed off, his jaw working as if chewing on words too bitter to speak. "She was a good woman, kind, too kind for the life she had." Era's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken of her mother with anything but dismissal or pity. Hearing this king, this powerful man, speak her name with something that sounded almost like reverence made her chest ache in ways she didn't understand. The king extended his hand, and for a moment Era thought he might strike her. Instead, his fingers, calloused and scarred, reached for the pendant. "May I?" She nodded, unable to form words. He lifted the necklace gently, turning it over in his palm, his eyes narrowing as he examined it in the torchlight. His breathing changed, became shallow and quick. His fingers traced the etched symbols with a familiarity that made Era's stomach drop. "Where did you learn to read runes, girl?" "I don't know how to read them, sire. I've worn it all my life, but I never knew what they said." The king's thumb pressed against the back of the pendant, and Era saw his entire body go rigid. The color drained from his face. His other hand shot out and gripped the edge of the nearest table so hard she heard his knuckles crack. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible, roughened by emotion she couldn't name. "R. Haraldson." The name meant nothing to Ira, but it clearly meant everything to the king. He staggered back a step, still holding the pendant, his eyes wide and glassy with shock. At the high table, Count Ragnar made a sound like a wounded animal and lurched to his feet. "Your Majesty, I can explain." "Sit down." The king's voice cracked like a whip, and Ragnar dropped back into his chair as if his legs had been cut from under him. "You will speak when I give you permission to speak, and not before." The king turned back to Era, and she saw something terrible in his face now, grief and fury, and a hunger for truth that made her want to run. This name, R. Haraldson. "Do you know whose name this is?" "No, Your Majesty. My brother." The words fell between them like stones. "My younger brother, who died 20 years ago in the Northern Campaign, who fell on a frozen battlefield 300 miles from here, who I buried with my own hands." His voice cracked. "Who wore a pendant exactly like this one, because I had it made for him the year he came of age." The hall seemed to tilt beneath Era. Her mind struggled to piece together what he was saying, but the implications were too vast, too impossible. If the pendant had belonged to the king's brother, and her mother had kept it all these years, then that meant Fridas was his lover. The king said it as fact, not question. "Before the war, my brother was stationed in this region for 6 months. He wrote to me about a woman he'd met, a servant girl who'd captured his heart. I told him to be careful, that love between nobles and commoners brought nothing but pain. His laugh was bitter, broken. I thought when he died that was the end of it, that their story ended on that battlefield." He looked down at Era with eyes that now held something new, a desperate, dangerous hope. "But if Fridas had his pendant, if she kept it all these years and gave it to you before she died, then you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The words hung unspoken in the charged air. You are blood of my blood. You are my niece. You are royal. Count Ragnar shot to his feet, his face twisted with panic and fury. This is madness, Your Majesty. This is nothing but coincidence. The girl's mother could have stolen that pendant, could have found it, could have what? The king rounded on him with such sudden violence that Ragnar stumbled backward. Could have stolen a piece that never left my brother's neck. Could have found it hundreds of miles from where he died. Could have kept it for a bastard child just for the fun of it. He advanced on the count, and Ara saw Ragnar's face go from red to white. Or is there something you're not telling me, Count? Something about how this girl came to be born in your castle, under your roof, from a woman my brother loved? Ragnar's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands shook so badly he had to grip the table to steady them. Your Majesty, I swear on my honor. Your honor. The king's voice dripped with contempt. Let's test that honor, shall we? Look at this girl. Look at her face. Tell me you see nothing of my brother in those eyes, in the shape of her jaw, in the way she holds herself even now, terrified and kneeling on cold stone. Against her will, Ara felt tears burning in her eyes. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to wake up and find this was all some cruel dream. But the pendant was solid in her hand, and the king's words were real, and Count Ragnar's terror was a living thing that filled the hall like smoke. The king knelt before her, a king kneeling before a servant girl, and took her face gently in his rough hands. Child, tell me true. Did your mother ever speak of your father? No, sire. Ara's voice broke. She died when I was born. No one ever spoke of her after. No one ever told me anything except that I was unwanted, that I was a mistake. Something in the king's face hardened into stone. He stood slowly, still holding the pendant, and turned to face Count Ragnar with eyes that promised judgment. Coincidence doesn't carry my family's crest, Ragnar. Coincidence doesn't wear my brother's name engraved in silver. And coincidence certainly doesn't look up at me with eyes the same shade as the brother I buried 2 decades ago. He held up the pendant so it caught the torchlight. This girl is blood of the north, blood of my house. And you... His voice dropped to something deadly quiet. You will tell me everything you know about how she came to be, or I will have the truth carved from your lying tongue. The torches flickered. Somewhere in the castle, a dog howled. And Ara knelt on the cold stone floor, her entire world shattering and reforming into something she didn't recognize, while the 2 men who held her fate in their hands circled each other like wolves. Dawn broke cold and merciless over the castle, painting the stone walls in shades of gray that matched the dread coiling in Ara's stomach. She hadn't slept. How could she, after what had happened in that hall? The king had dismissed them near midnight with a single command that still echoed in her ears. At first light, everyone assembles in the great hall. Everyone. The way he'd said it, like a judge pronouncing sentence, had made her blood run cold. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the narrow windows, Ara stood in the servants' corridor with her back pressed against the damp stone wall, trying to remember how to breathe. Her hands were covered in flour from the morning bread she'd been kneading when the bells rang, 3 sharp tolls that summoned every soul in the castle to the king's presence. Around her, servants whispered and speculated, their voices tight with fear and excitement. Something was happening, something that involved her. She could feel their eyes on her, curious and accusing in equal measure. Old Bjorn appeared at her elbow, his weathered face grim. He pressed something into her hand, a piece of bread still warm from the oven. Eat, he muttered. Whatever's coming, you'll need your strength. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her stomach twist. Not hope, but the kind of sadness that came from knowing how stories like hers usually ended. The great hall was already packed when they arrived. Nobles stood along the walls in their fine clothes, their faces masks of barely contained curiosity. Soldiers lined the doorways, hands resting on sword hilts. Servants clustered near the back, craning their necks to see. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Ara felt the weight of hundreds of eyes as she made her way through the crowd, felt the whispers following her like wasps. At the front of the hall, On the raised dais sat the king on a throne that had been brought down from the master chamber. Count Ragnar stood to his right, and Era's breath caught at the sight of him. The count looked like he hadn't slept either. His face was pale and drawn, deep shadows carved beneath his eyes. His hands trembled where they gripped the back of a chair, and when his eyes found Era in the crowd, something flashed across his face. Fear, yes, but also something darker, something that looked almost like hatred. The king stood, and silence fell like an axe. Every person in that hall seemed to stop breathing at once. He surveyed the assembled crowd with those ice-gray eyes, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the massive room. "I have called you here to witness truth." He paused, and Era saw his jaw tighten. 16 years ago, a child was born in this castle, a girl, the daughter of a servant woman named Fridas, who died bringing her into this world. His gaze swept the hall. "You all know this girl. You've watched her scrub your floors, empty your chamber pots, serve your meals. You've called her bastard, unwanted, a mistake." Era felt her face burn. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear, but her legs wouldn't move. Behind her, someone coughed. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The king's eyes locked onto Count Ragnar. Count Ragnar stepped forward. Ragnar moved like a man walking to the gallows, his boots scraping against the stone floor. He stopped at the base of the dais, and even from where she stood at the back of the hall, Era could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Tell these assembled witnesses," the king said, his voice deceptively soft. "Who is this girl? Speak her name, speak her lineage, and remember that you stand before your king and your God." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ragnar's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His throat worked convulsively. His eyes darted around the hall like a trapped animal seeking escape. Era felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. The moment stretched impossibly long, seconds feeling like hours, until finally, Ragnar sucked in a ragged breath. "She is." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder now. "She is an orphan, Your Majesty. A foundling I took in out of Christian charity. The daughter of a servant woman and some unknown man. Nothing more." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Era felt it like a physical blow, felt 16 years of rejection crystallize into this single moment of denial. The nobles shifted uncomfortably. Servants exchanged glances, and the king's face transformed into something terrible. An orphan. The words were soft, deadly. A foundling. Nothing more. He descended the dais steps slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking prey. "You stand before your king, before witnesses, before God himself, and you call this child nothing." Ragnar's face had gone from pale to gray. "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. I only meant, you meant to deny the truth." The king was close enough now that Ragnar had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "You meant to protect yourself, your reputation, your precious honor. Tell me, Count, when you look at this girl, what do you see?" "I see a servant, sire. Nothing more." The king's hand shot out faster than Ira thought possible for a man his age, grabbing Ragnar by the front of his tunic and hauling him up onto his toes. Several nobles gasped. A woman near the front swooned and had to be caught by her companion. "Liar." The single word dripped with contempt. The king released Ragnar with a shove that sent him stumbling backward. "You see what we all see. You see her mother's face, and you see blood that is not your own, and you see a truth that threatens the comfortable lies you've been living for 16 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Era's head spun. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the pendant beneath her rough dress, and the metal felt hot against her skin. Count Ragnar straightened his tunic with shaking hands, his face flushed now with humiliation and rage. "Your Majesty, please." Silence. The command cracked through the hall. The king turned to face the assembled crowd, and his voice rang out clear and terrible. "Let me tell you what this count will not. 20 years ago, my brother, my blood, the last of my father's line besides myself, died in the northern wars. Before he left for that campaign, he spent 6 months in this region, in this castle. And here he met a woman named Freydis, a servant, and he loved her. Era's knees went weak. The walls seemed to close in. She heard someone near her whisper, "Royal blood," and someone else hiss, "Impossible." The king continued, relentless as a storm. "My brother wore a pendant identical to the one this girl carries now. A pendant that never left his body. A pendant that somehow found its way to a servant woman who bore a child just months after he marched to his death. He pulled his own pendant from beneath his tunic, holding it up for all to see. Tell me, Count Ragnar, how does a foundling, how does nothing, come to wear the mark of the royal house?" Ragnar said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The crowd erupted in whispers that grew to a roar. Nobles pushed forward, trying to get a better look at Era. Servants grabbed at her arms, pulling her toward the front. She stumbled through the crowd in a daze, her mind unable to process what was happening, until she stood before the dais, before the king, with Count Ragnar trembling 5 paces away. The king looked down at her, and his eyes held something she'd never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not contempt, but recognition. He extended his hand. "Come here, child." Era climbed the steps on legs that barely held her. Up close, she could see the pendant around the king's neck clearly, the same hammer, the same runes, the same mark that had hung against her chest every day of her life. He placed his hand on her shoulder, and his touch was surprisingly gentle. "You asked me who this girl is," he said, addressing the hall but looking at Ragnar. "Let me tell you who she is not. She is not nothing. She is not a mistake. She is not unwanted." His voice grew harder. "She is blood of the North. She is my brother's legacy, and any man who denies this truth denies me." The hall erupted. Voices rose in shock, in excitement, in anger. Ira stood frozen, trapped in a nightmare that felt more terrifying than any fantasy. She looked at Count Ragnar and saw something in his eyes that made her blood ice. Not acceptance, not relief, but a hatred so deep and so pure it took her breath away. This wasn't over. Whatever the king proclaimed, whatever the crowd believed, she could see in Ragnar's face that he was harboring something darker, something that would destroy them all. And as the king raised his hand for silence, as nobles began to kneel and servants bowed their heads, Ira felt the pendant burning against her chest like a brand, marking her as something she never asked to be, something that might get her killed. The great hall had barely begun to settle from the king's proclamation when the massive oak doors burst open with a violence that made everyone jump. A figure stumbled through, a warrior, though calling him that seemed generous given his current state. He was covered head to toe in mud that had dried and cracked across his armor like diseased skin. Dark stains that could only be blood, old blood, days old, painted his chest and arms in grotesque patterns. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and wild, and he moved with the jerky, desperate energy of a man who'd been riding without sleep for longer than any human body should endure. The crowd parted like water as he staggered forward, leaving muddy boot prints on the stone floor. Several nobles pressed handkerchiefs to their noses. The man reeked of death and horses and something else, something that made Ira's stomach turn. He clutched something against his chest with both arms, cradling it like a child or a sacred relic, and as he came closer, she could see what it was. A shield, battered and scarred, with paint flaking off in chunks to reveal the wood beneath. But even damaged, even barely visible, the symbol on that shield was unmistakable. The same royal crest that hung in banners throughout the hall, the same mark that the king wore on his tunic. Era felt the air change, felt the collective intake of breath as everyone recognized what they were seeing. The warrior dropped to his knees before the dais with a crash that sounded like bones breaking. His voice, when he spoke, was raw as torn flesh. "Your Majesty, I bring news from the north." The king descended the steps quickly, his face a mask of controlled tension. "Speak, soldier. Where do you come from? How long have you been riding?" 7 days, sire." 7 days without stopping except to change horses. From the borderlands, from the old battlefield where—" His voice cracked and he had to swallow hard before continuing. where the great battle was fought. 20 years passed. A chill ran down Aira's spine. She saw the king's hand tighten on the hilt of his sword, saw his jaw clench. Around the hall, people leaned forward, hungry for whatever revelation was coming. Only Count Ragnar seemed to shrink back, his face losing what little color it had left. What news could possibly come from a battlefield 2 decades cold? The king's voice was steady, but Aira heard the tremor beneath it, the fear of a man who sensed his past rising up to meet him. The warrior lifted the shield higher, his arms shaking with exhaustion. "This shield, your majesty, it was found buried in the northern marsh, preserved by the cold and the peat. We only discovered it 3 weeks ago when the spring thaw shifted the ground." He turned the shield so the light caught the crest more clearly. "It bears the mark of House Haraldson." The name hit the hall like a thunderbolt. Aira's knees nearly buckled. She grabbed the edge of a nearby table to steady herself, her mind reeling. Haraldson, the name engraved on her pendant. The king's brother. Her father, if what the king believed was true. The king took the shield with trembling hands, running his fingers over the battered surface as if reading a message written in a language only he understood. "My brother carried this shield into battle. I saw him raise it on that final morning." His voice was barely audible. "They told me nothing was recovered from his body, that the field was too chaotic, too bloody, that he was buried in a mass grave with honors but without anything to bring home. There's more, sire." The warrior reached into his tunic and pulled out a leather pouch, so stained and weathered it looked like it might crumble to dust. This was strapped to the back of the shield, sealed with wax that somehow survived. "We didn't open it. We didn't dare. It bears your brother's personal seal." The king's hands shook as he took the pouch. The wax seal was indeed intact, cracked and yellowed with age, but still recognizable. A hammer, smaller and cruder than the pendants, but unmistakably the same symbol. He broke the seal with his thumb, and the sound of cracking wax seemed impossibly loud in the breathless silence. From inside the pouch he drew out a single piece of parchment, folded and refolded until it was no bigger than his palm. Aira watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his eyes move across the page once, twice, 3 times, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His lips moved silently, forming words that no one else could hear. And then she saw something she never thought she'd witness. A tear, single and silver, rolled down the king's weathered cheek and disappeared into his beard. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with emotion barely contained. "It's his handwriting, my brother's hand." He looked up at the assembled crowd, and his eyes were wet but fierce. He wrote this before the battle, before he knew he would die. His hands clutched the parchment so tightly it crumpled at the edges. He wrote about Fridas. The name rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Aira felt dizzy, felt the world tilting beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. This was too much, too impossible, too perfectly timed to be anything but cruel fate or divine intervention, and she didn't know which terrified her more. The king's voice grew stronger as he read aloud. "To my brother and king, should I fall in this battle and this letter somehow find its way home, know that I go to my death with peace in my heart, for I have known love. A woman named Fridas, a servant in Count Ragnar's house, has given me the greatest gift a man can receive, the promise of a future, even if I do not live to see it. She carries my child." The hall exploded. Voices rose in a cacophony of shock and excitement and denial. Nobles grabbed at each other, servants cried out, and through it all, Aira stood frozen, her ears ringing, her chest so tight she couldn't draw breath. The king's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "There is more." The crowd fell silent. "I have given her my pendant, the twin to yours, so that if anything happens to me, the child will have proof of their lineage. Brother, if you ever meet this child, if this letter ever reaches you and you find them—" His voice broke and he had to pause, jaw working with the effort of maintaining composure. "Treat them as you would treat me. Love them as I would have loved them. For they are blood of the north, blood of our father's line, and they deserve to know they were wanted." The final word hung in the air like an accusation. Era's vision blurred with tears she couldn't stop. Wanted. She'd spent 16 years believing she was unwanted, believing she was a mistake, a shameful secret. And all along, somewhere in the ground, in the cold northern mud, this letter had waited. This proof that someone, that her father, had wanted her before she was even born. The king turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her chest ache. "The pendant you wear, show it to me again." With shaking hands, Ira pulled the necklace from beneath her dress. The king held up his own pendant beside it, and even those at the back of the hall could see the truth. They were identical. Two halves of the same whole. Brother and brother, father and child, past and present converging in this impossible moment. The king looked at Count Ragnar, and his voice was cold enough to freeze blood. "You knew. All these years, you knew whose daughter she was, and you let her scrub floors. You let her believe she was nothing. You denied her the truth when you could have sent word to me, could have told me my brother left behind a legacy." He advanced on the count, and Ragnar stumbled backward, his face a mask of terror. "Why? What possible reason could you have to hide this child, to bury this truth?" Ragnar's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Sweat poured down his face despite the morning chill. His eyes darted wildly, looking for escape where none existed. And in that moment of silence, Era saw it, saw the terrible truth written in every line of his guilty face. He'd known, he'd always known. And he'd hidden her away, not out of ignorance or even simple cruelty, but for some darker reason that he would kill to protect. The king's hand moved to his sword. "Speak now, or I will have the truth carved from your tongue." And in that moment, as the hall held its breath and Count Ragnar trembled on the edge of confession, Era realized that whatever was about to be revealed would shatter everything she thought she understood about her life, her birth, and the man who'd spent 16 years pretending she didn't exist. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. Count Ragnar stood trembling before the king, his face a battleground of terror and resignation. Around them, the assembled crowd seemed to lean forward as one body, desperate to hear whatever confession was about to spill from his lips. Ira's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in the base of her skull. She wanted to run, to cover her ears, to escape whatever truth was about to shatter the fragile reality that had been built in the last hour. But her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, a witness to her own reckoning. Ragnar's lips moved soundlessly for a moment, then his shoulders sagged as if an invisible weight had finally broken him. When he spoke, his voice was hollow, defeated. "I knew because—" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Because I was there when she told me. Fridas. She came to me 3 months after your brother left for the war, Your Majesty. She was showing, barely, but enough that she knew she couldn't hide it much longer. She begged me for protection, for help." The king's knuckles went white on his sword hilt. "And what did you do?" "I promised her sanctuary. I told her she could stay in the castle, that I would protect her and the child, that when the war ended and your brother returned, I would help them marry properly." Ragnar's voice cracked. "I gave her my word as a nobleman. But my brother didn't return." The king's words were sharp as broken glass. "No, sire. When news came of his death, Fridas." Ragnar's eyes grew distant, haunted. "She wept for 3 days without stopping. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. Just sat in her chamber holding that pendant and crying until she had no tears left. And then she told me she was going to write to you, to tell you about the child." Era felt something cold slither down her spine. The way he said it, the pause before those words, carried a weight that promised horrors yet to come. I stopped her. The confession fell like an axe. Gasps echoed through the hall. The king took a step forward, murder written plainly on his face, but Ragnar held up his hands in desperate supplication. "Wait, please let me explain. I didn't do it out of cruelty, I swear on my soul. I did it because—" His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Because my wife had just lost our own child. Our 5th miscarriage in 6 years. She was half mad with grief, Your Majesty. When she learned there was a pregnant woman in the castle, a woman carrying a healthy child, she—" He squeezed his eyes shut. She threatened to throw herself from the tower. She said if she couldn't have a child, she couldn't bear to watch another woman have what God had denied her. The hall erupted in murmurs. Era's stomach churned. She remembered vague stories about the Countess, Ragnar's wife, who had died years ago. The servants had always spoken of her in hushed, pitying tones, but no one had ever told Era why. "So I made a choice," Ragnar continued, his voice strengthening with desperate justification. "I told Freydis that if she kept quiet about the child's father, if she let everyone believe it was a common bastard, I would make sure she and the baby were cared for, that they would never want for food or shelter. I thought," his voice broke, "I thought I was being merciful. I thought I was saving my wife's life and protecting Freydis and the child at the same time. You thought," the king's voice was deadly quiet, "you thought you had the right to hide my brother's legacy because your wife was grief-stricken. You thought you could deny me the knowledge that my bloodline continued because it was inconvenient. I was wrong." Ragnar fell to his knees, hands clasped in front of him like a man praying for salvation he knew he didn't deserve. "I know that now. I've known it every day for 16 years. But by the time my wife died, 5 years after Era was born, the lie had already become truth in everyone's minds. How could I suddenly announce that the bastard child everyone had been spitting on was actually royal? They would have asked why I waited. They would have questioned everything. My reputation, my honor, your honor." The king's roar shook the rafters. "You dare speak of honor? You let my niece, my brother's daughter, grow up as a servant? You let her scrub floors and empty chamber pots while you sat in your fine clothes and pretended she didn't exist. And all because you were too much of a coward to admit you'd been lying for 5 years. Era felt the words like physical blows. Every moment of humiliation, every whispered insult, every time she'd been pushed aside or spat at or told she was nothing, all of it could have been prevented. She could have grown up knowing her father's name. She could have been acknowledged, protected, loved. And instead, she'd been sacrificed on the altar of one man's pride and another man's cowardice. The king turned to face the assembled crowd, and his voice rang out with the authority of absolute judgment. "Let it be known from this moment forward, this girl shall no longer answer to whispers and shame. She is Ira, Harold's daughter, daughter of my brother, blood of the royal house, and niece to the crown." He gestured sharply, and soldiers moved forward to flank Era on either side. "From this day, anyone who speaks against her, who questions her lineage, who treats her with anything less than the respect due to royal blood, will answer to me personally." The sound that went through the hall was like wind through a wheat field, a collective exhale of awe and fear and excitement. Nobles began to bow, some deeply, others barely inclining their heads as they tried to process this sudden shift in the social order. Servants pressed themselves against the walls, eyes wide with shock. And through it all, Ira stood frozen, unable to feel triumph or joy or even relief. All she felt was a strange, hollowing numbness. The king placed his hand on her shoulder, and the touch was gentle despite the rage still burning in his eyes. "You will come with me to the capital. You will be educated, clothed properly, taught the ways of court. You will take your rightful place in this world." But even as he spoke, even as soldiers began to escort Count Ragnar away, and nobles pressed forward to offer congratulations that felt more like calculations, Era caught sight of Ragnar's face, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. Not remorse, not acceptance, but a hatred so pure and venomous it seemed to poison the very air. His eyes locked on hers for just a moment, and in that glance she saw a promise. This wasn't over. Whatever the king decreed, whatever title she was given, Ragnar knew something. Some final secret that he'd kept even from this confession. As the hall began to empty, as arrangements were made and orders given, the king drew Ira aside into a small alcove. His face was softer now, grief mixing with the anger. "I know this is overwhelming, child. I know your entire world has been turned upside down, but I want you to understand something." He took both her hands in his, and his grip was warm, solid. "My brother loved your mother. and he wanted you. Whatever lies you've been told, whatever shame you've carried, know that you were wanted from the moment your father learned of your existence. Ira's throat constricted. Tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over, tracking hot lines down her cheeks. Why? The word came out broken. Why did it take 16 years? Why did I have to suffer all that time before the truth came out? The king had no answer. What answer could there be? God's will? Fate? The casual cruelty of men who valued their comfort over truth? He simply pulled her into an embrace, and Era, who had never been hugged, never been held with affection in her entire life, broke down completely. She sobbed into the chest of a king she'd only known for 2 days, grieving for the childhood she'd lost and the father she would never meet. But even in that moment of release, even wrapped in the protection of royal arms and royal decree, she couldn't shake the image of Count Ragnar's eyes. That look of hatred mixed with something else, something that looked terrifyingly like knowledge. He knew something still, something that could destroy her. And in the shadows of the alcove, where no one else could see, the pendant around her neck seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of all the secrets it had kept was finally becoming too much to bear. The castle settled into uneasy sleep as midnight approached, but Era lay wide awake in the chamber she'd been given, a room with actual tapestries on the walls, a bed with clean linens, a window that looked out over the valley instead of the stinking stable yard. It should have felt like a dream come true. Instead, it felt like a gilded cage. She couldn't stop thinking about Count Ragnar's face as the guards had led him away. Couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was still coiled beneath the surface of today's revelations, waiting to strike. A soft knock at her door made her jolt upright, heart hammering. Before she could respond, the door creaked open and a figure slipped inside. Count Ragnar, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, now rumpled and stained with what might have been wine or might have been something darker. His eyes were wild, rimmed with red, and he moved with the jerky desperation of a man who'd burned all his bridges and had nothing left to lose. "Don't scream," he hissed, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you. His voice cracked. "I need to talk to you, alone, before they take you away tomorrow and I never get another chance." Era's hand moved instinctively to the knife old Bjorn had given her years ago, which she kept under her pillow. But something in Ragnar's face stopped her from reaching for it. Not the hatred she'd seen earlier, but something more complex. Anguish and shame and a desperate need to unburden himself. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders like armor. "The guards let you go?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Bought them off." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out even royal soldiers have a price when a man offers them enough gold." He moved closer, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, she could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I lied today, in the hall, not about everything, but about the most important thing." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Era's stomach dropped like a stone into dark water. "What do you mean?" Ragnar sank into the chair by her bedside as if his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. His hands shook as he pressed them against his face, and when he spoke his voice was muffled and broken. "Your mother, Freydis. She didn't just love the king's brother, she loved me too. Or thought she did. I don't know anymore. It was all so tangled, so wrong." Era felt the room tilt. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that before Haraldsson came to this castle, before he ever set eyes on Freydis, she and I..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like a noose. My wife couldn't conceive. Year after year of trying, of prayers, of her crying herself to sleep. And Freydis was kind to me. She saw my pain. We were both lonely, both desperate for something we couldn't have. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It happened 3 times, just 3 times, in the stables, in the dark. And then Haraldsson arrived, and he was everything I wasn't. Young, strong, noble, full of life. Freydis fell for him completely. She forgot about me, or tried to." The weight of what he was implying crashed over Ira like a wave. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "No." The letter said, "The pendant." The letter said she was carrying Haraldsson's child, and maybe she was. Probably she was. But Era? He looked up at her with eyes full of tortured uncertainty. The timing. Those 3 times with me happened right before Haraldson arrived. And when she told me she was pregnant 3 months after he left for war, I counted backward. I counted, and I prayed, and I hoped, and I feared, because I didn't know. She didn't know. How could either of us know for certain whose seed had taken root? Era's mind reeled. The pendant, the letter, the king's proclamation. Everything that had happened today suddenly felt like it was built on sand. You're lying. You're trying to take this away from me because you can't stand that I have something you tried to deny me. I'm telling you the truth. His voice rose, then dropped again as he fought for control. God help me. I'm telling you what I've been carrying for 16 years. When Freydis came to me pregnant, she was so certain it was Haraldsson's child. She loved him so completely, had convinced herself that those 3 nights with me meant nothing, that God would never curse the child of true love by making it the bastard of an affair instead. She gave you that pendant because she wanted to believe, because she needed to believe. But she died, Era whispered, horror dawning. She died before she could ever know the truth. Yes, Ragnar's hands clenched into fists. And I convinced myself, that it didn't matter. That even if you were mine, even if my blood ran in your veins instead of Haraldsson's, it was better for everyone if you just remained a nameless bastard, better than admitting adultery, better than destroying my dead wife's memory, better than facing the possibility that I might have a daughter I could never claim. The room spun. Era pressed her hands against her temples, trying to hold her fracturing reality together. So everything today, the king's proclamation, the recognition, the royal blood, it might all be a lie. Or it might all be true. Ragnar leaned forward desperately. That's the hell of it, don't you see? You might be Haraldsson's daughter. The pendant, the timing, the way Freydis loved him. It all points that way. But there's a chance, however small, that you're mine. That you're not royal blood at all. Just the bastard daughter of a count and a servant, dressed up in borrowed legitimacy. Era felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Why are you telling me this? Why now, after I finally have something, after I finally matter? Because you deserve to know the truth. His voice broke completely. Because I've watched you suffer for 16 years because of my cowardice. And now I'm watching you be elevated to something you might not be. And either way, it's my fault. Because if you go to the capital, if you take your place at court as the king's niece, and somehow, someday the truth comes out. He grabbed her hands, his grip desperate. Era, they'll execute you for fraud, for deceiving the crown. The king's mercy will turn to rage, and you'll lose your head for a lie you didn't even know you were living. The weight of it crashed over her like a collapsing building. For a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a raw whisper. What do you want me to do? I don't know. Ragnar released her hands and stood, pacing the small room like a caged animal. Tell the king the truth and risk losing everything? Stay silent and live as an imposter? Run away and disappear before you're trapped in a lie too big to escape? He stopped and looked at her with something that might have been love or might have been guilt. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. I failed you as a father, whether I'm your real father or not. I won't tell you what to do now, but I needed you to know. I needed you to choose your path with your eyes open. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. For what it's worth, I hope you are Haraldsson's daughter. I hope that pendant is proof and not just a symbol of Freydis's desperate wish. Because you deserve to be something more than what I could have given you. His voice dropped to barely audible. You deserve to be wanted, to be royal, to matter. Then he was gone, slipping out into the dark corridor and leaving Era alone with a truth more devastating than any lie. She sat in the moonlight, clutching the pendant that might be her salvation or her damnation, and tried to understand what honor meant when truth and lies were so tangled they became the same thing. Outside her window, the castle was silent. Inside her chest, her heart screamed with questions that had no answers. Was she royal blood or common fraud? Her father's daughter or another man's mistake? And if she didn't know, if no one could ever know for certain, what was she supposed to do with the crown that had been placed on her head? The pendant felt heavy as an anchor around her neck. She pulled it off and held it up to the moonlight, studying the runes that spelled out Haraldsson's name. The name of the man who might be her father, or might not be. The man who had wanted her, or who would have wanted whoever's child she actually was. Dawn was still hours away, but Era knew she wouldn't sleep. How could she when every choice before her led to either living a lie or destroying the only chance she'd ever have to be something more than a mistake? When morning came, the king would expect an answer about going to the capital, and she would have to decide whether to tell him the truth that might destroy her, or stay silent and let the lie become her life. In the darkness, she pressed the pendant against her heart and whispered a prayer to a mother she'd never known and a father she might never truly identify. "What do I do? What would you want me to do?" But the dead, as always, remained silent. And the choice, terrible and impossible and hers alone, waited for dawn. Dawn broke gray and cold over the castle, but Era had already been awake for hours. She'd spent the darkest part of night on her knees in the small chapel attached to the castle's east wing, the only place she could think to go when her room felt like it was suffocating her. The stone floor bit into her knees through her thin dress, but she welcomed the pain. It was real, solid, something she could understand when everything else had turned to smoke and shadows. "Lord, what's worth more, the truth or peace?" The words fell from her lips in a broken whisper, her voice hoarse from crying. "Everyone finally sees me, finally thinks I matter. How can I take that away? How can I tell them it might all be built on uncertainty?" Her hands clutched the pendant so tightly the edges cut into her palm. "But how can I live a lie? How can I stand before that king, before all those people, and pretend I know for certain what I am when I don't?" The chapel remained silent except for the whisper of wind through the narrow windows and the distant cry of a rooster announcing morning. The crucified Christ on the wall stared down at her with painted eyes that offered no answers, only witnessed her anguish. Era pressed her forehead against her clasped hands and wept, not the dramatic sobs of yesterday, but something quieter and more profound. The tears of someone who had finally been given everything they'd ever wanted, only to discover it tasted like ashes. She didn't hear the chapel door open, didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching, didn't know she wasn't alone until a gentle hand touched her shoulder and a familiar voice spoke, rough with emotion and sleep deprivation. "Child, what troubles you so deeply that you kneel here before dawn?" Era's head snapped up. The king stood beside her, still wearing yesterday's clothes, his face haggard and lined with exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept either, like something had driven him from his chambers to wander the castle in the dark. And from the way he was looking at her, with a mixture of concern and understanding that made her chest ache, she suspected he'd been standing in the shadows, listening for longer than she realized. "Your Majesty, Her voice failed. How could she begin? Where were the words to explain the impossible choice she faced? The king lowered himself onto the stone floor beside her with a grunt, his old knees protesting the movement. Up close in the thin morning light filtering through the stained glass, he looked ancient, not just old, but weighted with years of decisions and their consequences. "You've been crying," he observed quietly, "and not tears of joy. Something has happened since yesterday, something that's made you question everything." It wasn't a question. Era's throat constricted. The truth sat on her tongue like a stone, too heavy to swallow, too dangerous to spit out. But looking into his weathered face, seeing the genuine concern there, she found she couldn't hold it back any longer. "The dam broke. Count Ragnar came to my room last night." The words tumbled out in a rush. "He told me. He said that before your brother ever came to this castle, he and my mother had—" She couldn't finish, couldn't say the words aloud. But she didn't need to. Understanding dawned in the king's eyes like a terrible sunrise. "He claims he might be your father." "He doesn't know. That's the worst part. My mother didn't know. The timing. It could be either of them. Or maybe she wanted so desperately for me to be your brother's child that she convinced herself it was true. The pendant, the letter, everything points to Haraldsson. But there's this shadow of doubt, this possibility that I'm not royal at all, just another bastard dressed up in borrowed glory. The words poured out faster now, desperate and raw. And I don't know what to do. If I tell you this and it turns out I really am your niece, I've thrown away my only chance at a real life for nothing. But if I stay silent and someday the truth comes out, they'll execute me for deceiving the crown. Either way I lose. Either way I'm damned. The king was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the altar at the front of the chapel. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute conviction. Let me tell you something about blood, child. I've spent 53 years on this earth, 26 of them as king. I've made decisions that sent men to their deaths. I've elevated nobles and stripped titles from others. I've watched my brother die in my arms on a frozen battlefield 300 miles from home. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were wet but fierce. And in all that time I've learned that blood, true blood, the kind that matters, isn't measured in lineage or names written in books. It's measured here. He tapped his chest over his heart. But the law was written by men trying to make sense of chaos. He reached out and took her hands in his grip warm and solid. Yes, if you're Haraldson's daughter by blood, you're royal. But Era, listen to me. Even if you're not, even if Ragnar's seed was the one that took root, you are still my brother's daughter in every way that matters. Freydis loved him. He loved her. He wanted you. That letter proves it. He claimed you before you were born, gave your mother his most precious possession to mark you as his. Isn't that a kind of fatherhood more real than mere biology? Era's vision blurred with fresh tears. How can you say that? How can you risk everything on faith, on feeling? What if the nobles find out? What if someone questions my legitimacy and demands proof I can't give? Then I will tell them what I'm telling you now. The king's voice grew stronger, more certain. Honor isn't about blood purity or perfect lineage. It's about the choices we make, the truth we speak, the courage we show when everything else falls away. He released one of her hands to cup her cheek, his calloused thumb wiping away her tears. You came here this morning to pray, to ask God whether truth or peace matters more. But you already know the answer, don't you? Otherwise, you wouldn't be torturing yourself with this choice. Era closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a cloak. He was right. She'd known from the moment Ragnar left her room what she had to do, had known it even as every fiber of her being screamed against it. I have to tell them, she whispered. I have to tell everyone the truth, that I might not be who you proclaim me to be, that there's doubt, that I could be committing fraud just by accepting this title. Her voice broke. Even if it costs me everything. Especially if it costs you everything. The king stood slowly, then extended his hand to help her up. That's what honor is, Era. Not the easy choice or the safe one, the right one, even when it destroys us. They stood together in the empty chapel as full morning light began to stream through the windows, painting the stone walls in colors of gold and crimson. The king kept hold of her hand, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion, barely contained. My brother wrote that letter knowing he might die. He claimed you knowing he might never meet you. He gave you his name and his symbol knowing it might cost him everything if anyone discovered he'd loved a servant. The king's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He chose honor over safety, truth over comfort, and because he made that choice, you exist. You're here, you matter. He squeezed her hand. Now you have to make the same choice he did. Live the truth, even if it kills you. Because living a lie, even a comfortable one, is a death of a different kind. Era felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock clicking open or a burden finally being set down. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, something that felt almost like peace. Will you stand beside me when I tell them? When I confess that I might be a fraud? I will stand beside you precisely because you're willing to confess it. The king smiled, sad but genuine. That's how I know you carry my brother's blood, Era. Not because of some pendant or letter or timing of conception, but because you're willing to sacrifice everything for truth. That's Haraldson through and through. That's the blood of the North. They left the chapel together as the castle began to wake around them. Servants scurried through corridors, nobles emerged from their chambers, and somewhere a bell tolled, calling everyone to morning mass. Within the hour, the great hall would fill again, and Ira would have to stand before them all and speak words that might strip away everything she'd been given yesterday. But as she walked beside the king, her hand still clasped in his, the pendant resting against her heart, she felt something she'd never experienced in her 16 years of scrubbing floors and swallowing shame. She felt worthy, not because of whose blood might run in her veins, but because she'd chosen truth over lies, honor over safety, the hard right over the easy wrong. And if they condemned her for it, if they called her fraud and sent her back to the kitchens or worse, at least she would face that judgment knowing she'd earned the one thing no blood or title could grant: integrity. The king squeezed her hand one final time before they entered the hall. "Whatever happens now," he murmured, "know that you are my brother's daughter. Biology be damned. You're his in every way that matters." And Ira, bastard or royal, fraud or princess, found she could finally breathe. Ira's story forces us to confront an impossible question. What is worth more? A comfortable lie that gives us everything we've ever wanted, or a devastating truth that might destroy us? She spent 16 years being told she was nothing, only to discover she might be royalty. And in that moment of glory, when the world finally saw her, she had to choose between silence and integrity. How many of us would have the courage to confess uncertainty when confession means losing everything? How many of us would choose honor over safety, truth over peace, especially after a lifetime of rejection and shame? The real tragedy isn't that Ira might not be royal blood. It's that she needed a king's proclamation to believe she mattered at all. Her worth was never in a pendant or a name carved in silver. It was in her courage to speak truth when lies would have been easier. It was in her willingness to sacrifice glory for integrity. That's the blood that truly matters, not what flows in our veins, but what drives our choices when everything is on the line. Ira learned that being wanted isn't about biology or birthright. It's about being worthy of the life we claim, even when that claim costs us everything. So I ask you, if you discovered your entire identity might be built on uncertainty, would you have the strength to confess it? Would you risk losing everything for a truth that might destroy you? Think about that. And if this story moved you, if it made you question what honor really means, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge us to live with courage and integrity. Because the best stories aren't the ones that comfort us. They're the ones that force us to become better than we were before we heard them.